Okay, so I'm going to talk about what learning analytics can tell us about how students use lecture recordings. And this is based on a large study that I did with a colleague, John Conway, based on the 2014-15 academic year. And we looked at 17 modules across natural sciences. So this was across 4 departments, chemistry, maths, physics and life sciences. And it was involving hundreds of students on these modules. And our aim was to see what the students were actually doing, how they were actually using the materials, and then from that to hopefully get some actionable insights, which is the buzzword, things that we could actually do or change or look at in more detail. And these are the things that we found. We found some advice for staff and students on how best to use recordings, topics for further investigation, and we also got some ideas about what features we would like to have in a production scale learning analytics system. So the system that we were using was very bespoke and handcrafted, and from that we're learning how we might like to do this on a larger scale. So when we talk about learning analytics, we're looking at collecting and analysing and reporting on data, and it's important that it's not just the click data, it's not just about what happens, but it's actually that in combination with the learners themselves and also the context that they're in. Because I think that very often we have reports of, lecture capture does X, lecture capture does Y. And you see every different result is available in the literature because it's very much context sensitive. So different studies will find different results, and what we want to do is to find the results for our students in our context. And the reason for doing it is to help with learning. That's really helping with learning and looking at the environment in which the learning occurs. So this is what we're doing. We've got click data, which is the students' interaction with online materials. And I would say we also have clock data, which is that it will often tell us the date and time, and also how long a student interacts with something. And then we need to put that into the context of the students. It's not in general, it's specific students that we want to know what they're doing. And we also want to look at the context that they're doing it in. Then we analyse it, and the outcomes that we can have predictive learning analytics, which are on the level of the individual student. So that's where we're using algorithms, AI, all these new buzzwords, and the idea is to try to make interventions for individual students to help with progress, to help with retention, and so on. And that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the other type of analytics, which is where we're looking at the student body as a whole, and the module as a whole, or the course. And we're going to use techniques such as visualizations and reports, and learn general lessons, hopefully, that we can apply. So here's a capture from Wikipedia of a user's editing activity. And I saw this and I thought, well, you can't do that. You can't publish what a particular editor has interacted with in Wikipedia. Surely that's violating that person's rights. And then it said, Pearl is a robot. So if it's a robot, you can do this. But if it was an individual student, we couldn't do this. So we have to be sure that all the student data that we use it legally and ethically and appropriately. So we're using student data, and so we have to process it and store it carefully, and especially if we're going to use any sensitive data. So if we're using any information about disabilities, ethnicity and so on, then that's termed as sensitive data, and we have to take even greater care with that. And we recommend that if you're doing general descriptive analytics and you don't need to know who the individual student is, that it's a good idea to anonymise the data so that we don't know which individual is which. And also take care, when publishing, if you publish data about students and you publish lots of different views of that data, it may be possible to work out who a particular student is. And and identify them in that way. So we follow the guidelines from that are used by UCISA and so on, that we don't publish any data for students if the group is smaller than 10 people, so that then you wouldn't want to have students being identified. And I should say on all of this that I'm not a legal expert. This is my understanding of the legal situation, and I think that it's everyone should be talking with their own legal services departments and so on to make sure that everything that we do is correct and within the law. But one of the things that I've learned from my legal services friends is that we ideally want to record the information for all the students. And if we record data if we use data that's recorded anyway for the general business purposes, which is admin use, statistical use, and it's noted within the privacy notice that the students, they're told that this is how the data will be used, then we can use that data for our analytics. Which is really good, because it's very beneficial if we use all the students, because then we won't have any sampling error, we won't have any bias in the results that we find. If we were to study something that wasn't generally being recorded as part of our normal business, then it would be a study, and we would have to go for ethical approval, and the students would have the right to opt out, and so then we might get a different picture. So if someone had eaten all the coconut rolls from our all sorts, and we did an analysis of the nutritional content, we'd find no coconut. But that was because we've got a biased sample. So we need to have all the all sorts, but also we don't want to have anything else in there. So we don't want to have staff data. We don't want to be recording staff data as part of our analysis. And so it's important that we categorise then, that we categorise the data and choose what we're going to include and what we're going to omit, and also what we're going to compare. So I have a question, which is, what factors might affect student use of lecture recordings? What things might we want to investigate, and what factors might have a bearing on the amount of use? And I've got some ideas here, and if anyone has any other thoughts or any questions about these ideas. English as an additional language. That's okay. That's a really hard one, I think. English as an additional language. If we look at a pot of students who have English as an additional language, then that pot in one institution will be different from another institution which has different entry requirements for English. And it may be different for different subject areas. And so to look in the literature and say, I see here that lecture recording benefits student with English as an additional language, sometimes it might not, because the pot that you're looking at may be different. You're not comparing like with like. But within your own context, you can look at students with or without English as an additional language and find the answer in your context for your students. Something else that I've got here is lecture attendance. At Imperial, we don't normally record attendance at lectures, and so none of my analysis included lecture attendance as a variable, although staff were very interested to know about that. If we had included lecture attendance, then it would have become a study. We would have had to give students the chance to opt out, and so then it wouldn't have been comprehensive. So that was a decision we made at that time. Something else you might notice here is that some of these items are related to timing. So whether students procrastinate, whether there's different use depending on the time of the lecture. I think we had one of the students upstairs was saying that about lectures late at night, and how things are timetabled. So again, we're looking at what people do, how they do it, when they do it. So we're going to categorise all of our different data in different ways. And the next thing we need to do is validate that we've done it correctly. So here we've got, it's a range of lectures we've got lectures 1 to 9 here, and the one at the end, the last one, that's the mean amount of viewing that we have. And there's very little viewing of lecture 9. So then what we've done in cases like this is to go in and check it out, and it turned out this wasn't a lecture at all, it was a problem class. And that's why there was very little viewing, because it was a different type of content. And so we were categorising by type of content, and we want to categorise lectures differently from problem classes, so we can see how students use lectures and how they use problem classes, how they use tutorial recordings and so on. But it's really important to check that it's categorised in the correct way. We also found that if a lecture recording was faulty, if the microphone hadn't been turned on, then there was very low use. And so then we omitted those from our studies as well, because that would skew the results if we had faulty recordings included. And we were able to pick these out using visualisations. The staff were able to say, oh, I know why that happened. If you say at the start of a lecture, this won't be included in the exam, students won't watch the recording. Some of them will even walk out at that point. So that's validation. And then once we've validated everything and categorised everything, we can compare apples with apples. But the apples won't necessarily be the same as each other, but we'll be able to make a fair comparison. The first thing that we're going to do now is look at two courses. The blue one is Maths, Differential Equations, and the green one is Life Sciences, Macromolecular Structure and Function. And we see a range of students who've used a certain percentage of the lecture recorded minutes that were available to them. So we've made it a percentage so we can compare like with like, rather than saying how many minutes did they view, because there may be different minutes on each course. But there's a problem with the scales here, because I've got different scales. This one's got 60 and this one's got 100, so we can't really compare those. And it's going to be easier if we compare them by also ranking all the students in order. So here are the two graphs when we rank them in order. And we see that in general there's a lot more use in the Macromolecular Structure and Function, the Life Sciences course, with the maximum being nearly 150% of all the minutes available were viewed. In Maths, there's much lower amount of use. And in general, we saw that within each different degree, within each subject area, the modules were similar to each other. But between the subject areas, we saw big differences, even although they were all science subjects. So Maths and Life Sciences were the extremes, chemistry and physics were in the middle. But if we look kind of at the mid-range for Maths students, it turns out it's about 10% of all the minutes that were viewed by Maths students over all the average. And for Life Sciences students, it turns out it's about 30%. So I've got the figures here. So about the same percentage of students in the class viewed recordings, they used recordings, but the amount that they viewed was very different. In Maths, 10% of all the recorded minutes. In Life Sciences, 30% of all the recorded minutes. And another difference was in when it was used. So in Maths, it was very much used in the learning period, just around the time of the lectures, 87% use in the learning period, and in Life Sciences, 42% in the learning period, with most of the use being in the revision period. So these are large differences between different subjects. And this is an area for future research. This is something that we really want to look into. Here are some actual breakdown of the use. We've got on the left-hand side, we've got when the lecture occurred. The black line on the left-hand side is when the lecture occurred, and the black line on the right-hand side is when the exam was. In Maths, the students tend to use the materials immediately. They dip in, they use a small amount, they go straight to the bit that they didn't understand, they look at it, they understand it, and then they move on and they don't go back to that recording again. In life sciences, students are using it a lot more. They're using the end-to-end, the whole recording, and they're using it throughout the whole time from the lecture right through to the exam. And we don't know why. We don't know if it's to do with the content. It might be to do with timetabling. You'll notice that maths have got they've got 2 lectures on one day and then a gap of a week, and then they've got lectures again on Monday and Tuesday. Whereas life sciences often they have several lectures in one day. So they cram in the teaching so that then they've got time for practical work. In maths it's more about introducing a topic, then having problem classes, thinking about that topic, then having the next topic introduced. So we don't know if that has got something to do with it. Also, the assessment regime might have something to do with these differences. We don't know the answer on that. So that's something for further investigation. So next we can look at subgroups. So we can look at the graph that we saw before of the number of percentage of minutes viewed in macromolecular structure and function by individual students, and now we can put the grades on here. So we don't see all the fails at one end or the other end, we don't see all the firsts at one end or the other end. The grades are distributed throughout this graph. And then we can gather all these dots together into different pots. We can see the distributions for each of the different grades, and there are big differences in use within a particular grade band. Then we can look at the summary statistics. We've got the mean and the interquartile range, and then we can put on some confidence intervals. These are 95% confidence intervals, so if the notches overlap, we can say there's no significant difference between the different groups here. And what we see is that in our case, on this course, we saw no difference in use between the different grades overall. And we saw that on all of our courses. So what is interesting here is to say, well, we've got students who are using the materials at a similar level, but ending up with very different results. So how are they using it? And that's really the next question, and that's where we want to get into some qualitative analysis and actually find out, which will then become a study, which will then require ethical approval, the right to opt out, and so on. So that we can now hone in on, well, what's going to be of interest. We can ask students, did you use it a lot? Did you get a good grade at the end of it? Can you tell us how you used it? Something else we were able to do was to look at when students used it. And there was quite a difference between when this student and this student used the recordings. And here's an overview of that, which shows the proportion of initial accesses in the learning period or the revision period. And what we see is that students who ended up with first-class results had used the materials earlier. Now, we can't say that that's a causal link, but we have seen the same pattern with other learning materials. So we've seen the same pattern with general use of materials on the VLE and also with formative quizzes in the VLE. So earlier use of learning materials at the time of the lectures may have a beneficial effect on the learning. And procrastinating and cramming at the end may not be such a beneficial learning strategy, although clearly it may vary from student to student. So with having found information like this, our next step was to tell the students about it. So this is a slide from a study skills lecture, which says we haven't found any difference in attainment based on how much people use the lecture recordings. So you can choose to use it or not use it, but you don't have to use it in order to succeed. If you do use it wisely. Use it early. And the graph at the bottom here is quite an interesting one because it's actually a flipped video, so a video that students were meant to watch before a classroom session. And here it's correlated with grades. We've got the pink is firsts, so we've got firsts, 2As, 2Bs, thirds, and the students who went on to fail, none of them watched it at all. So if we tell you to watch something, then watch it. But otherwise, choose what works for you. So after we'd shared this information with the students, this was the result you saw previously, and 36% of all minutes were viewed. In 16-17, after the students had been given that advice, a lot more use was earlier on the course. There was less use overall, 32% of minutes rather than 36% of minutes, and the use was earlier. And we can't say it was the cause, but we saw an improvement in results. So, some information for lecturers. We saw this on many courses. If a lecture was delayed for any reason, then the overall usage was much lower. If the release of the lecture was delayed. So that might be for a technical reason, whatever. And so our advice to lecturers was don't delay the release of recordings because it will result in lower usage. We had one particular course, statistical physics, where the lecturer wanted to edit his recordings before he released them. And you can see the line on the left, and then the lecture which is when the lecture was, then the recording was released sometime later. And in this case, these are the statistics, 11% of minutes viewed, 49% in the learning period. When we suggested that he should release earlier, he released earlier in 16-17, and the number of minutes viewed increased. More of the viewing was in the learning period, and unfortunately we don't have any grade data, we don't have comparable grade data between the two cohorts to say whether that had an impact. But we would hope that earlier viewing would have resulted in better learning. So those are all the points that we learned from our analysis. Some of these we would suggest would be useful to feed into a production level system, how data should be used, how the analysis should be undertaken, and then the whole point of it is to get to the actionable insights, to get to the outcomes of improving teaching learning, how we implement the system, and so on. Looking at specific actions, advice we can give to people, and areas where we can explore further. So that's that.
So has anybody got any questions? Okay, I'll probably start.
Thank you. You showed the graphs indicating student viewing versus the student index across the x-axis. Is that data produced automatically and fed to the lecturers automatically, or is it just something you've done as part of the review of this process?
So at the moment, this was done as a kind of pilot study of how we would use learning analytics, and it's very much handcrafted. It's not real time. It's done after the event, and it's designed to be looking for these insights. It's not at the moment a quick feedback system. In time, when there's a production level system, then that would be the aim and the hope that there would be the possibility to have a quicker turnaround.
I was at a conference last week, and Moira was talking about the work that they've done on using why students don't attend. And one of the things she pinpointed that I didn't see on your slide, but I wonder if you had any insights about finance. So students were struggling to afford to actually the cost of travel. If they had like one lecture in a day, they would kind of make a decision not to attend and instead use the capture. But if they had 3 or 4 lectures in a day, then in fact it was worthwhile spending the money to come in.
Yeah, I haven't got any data from this analysis on that, but we certainly have that comment from students. If they have a piece of work to physically hand in, and that's the only thing they have on that day, then they're really disappointed and annoyed by it, really, because they're having to travel in, perhaps from quite a distance, to physically hand something in, or else hand it in a day early, which gives them less time to work on it. And so I think that timetabling is really important, One thing we have found is a lot of use of lectures at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, which is after the students' sports night in the bar. And what's good is that they are actually looking at the recordings, so they may be lying in bed and not attending, but they are actually using the recordings to catch up. That's what's the word? Anecdotal. I don't know if that's the reason why they haven't come in. It may also be to do with timetabling.
In terms of talking about the transparency for academics viewing the data, do you think there's, you're showing that time viewing doesn't really relate to their grade, because different students have different requirements or ways of revising or understanding the course material. So is there some potential that, like with Turnitin, for example, they will associate a bigger number or a smaller number with it being better or worse, and that means that feeding that information back to them not actually be the best place to live.
Feeding.
So giving the information directly to the academics without any context, without any understanding of how to analyse that.
Yeah. So when we were conducting this analysis, we were sitting down with all the academics and going through the results with them and finding out what their views were and also what other analyses they might like us to perform. Because I think that it's really important that it's about learning the context and so on, and seeing, is this what you expected? A lot of it's to do with, are the students using the materials in the way that you expect? And if not, why not? And what can be changed about that?
I suppose when you start scaling up and putting it into a not a bespoke system, then it becomes transparent without context. Then this is a very good, it's fantastic when you can do it, when you can talk to them about everything and walk through everything with them, but without that, there is some concern that data will be used in not a productive manner.
Yeah, but it is whole module data. It's not individual data, and I think that the staff have a good idea of what's going on in their module anyway, because they're there. And so I think that some of this will, sometimes it might pleasantly surprise them to see how students are using the materials, and sometimes they may say, oh, well, I didn't expect them not to view something which I said wasn't going to be examined. I said this was something really interesting and useful, and they haven't engaged with it. I should perhaps change the approach with that material.
Yes, other questions?
Possibly beyond the scope of our study, but you mentioned about excluding defective presentation. I think actually that's probably one thing that does need studying is sort of why sort of viewership of defective presentations. There's different reasons, such as technically the recording wasn't made correctly, playback issues. That's something we consider studying.
Yeah, we didn't actually study it, but we could have done, because we categorised all the faulty recordings as faulty recordings. In 14-15 we were using Panopto on site, and we had a lot of technical problems at that point. Now we've moved to the cloud and we have far fewer technical problems. I don't know if we'd have a big enough sample now because, well, apart from people not turning their microphones on, everything else seems to work quite smoothly. And in fact, they don't even have to turn them on, they just have to not mute them. It is interesting, and certainly it's something that we would like to see if we have,